gives me great pleasure to be afforded the opportunity to present this final lecture of the 2023 series to you. And I hope that everyone will enjoy the lecture, find the subject matter stimulating and useful in terms of understanding Ireland's very complex 19th century history. And before I get into the lecture itself, I just want to kind of give a brief outline of what I'm going to speak about tonight. So the lecture incorporates a small sample of my PhD research, and will commence by contextualising Ireland's place in the unequal union of 1801 and Ireland's unstable relationship with both empire and colonialism thereafter. We'll discuss the company's Kilkenny and indeed Irish soldiers in the period 1830 to 1860. We'll quantify and relate them within their historical context, and we'll address considerations like how many were there, where did they come from, what motivated their enlistment, what about considerations like camaraderie and the forging of soldierly networks in India, how were they perceived by those who enlisted them and by those left at home. And those left at home, of course, would include Irish nationalists of all hues at the time. And then I'll present a series of what I call micro case studies. Generally speaking, rank and file soldiers whom we're kind of focusing on tonight don't leave a huge amount of historical traces of themselves, but by pulling what is there together and synthesizing it, we're able to construct little case studies that hopefully will shed light on the soldiering experience in India. And finally, we'll seek to draw some conclusions from our discussions tonight. The lecture with slide discussion will last about an hour and a quarter, so you can set your timers on that. Time will be afforded at the end for questions, and I would appreciate if you could hold the questions until we're finished with the lecture. And also then, I'd like, if we have time, to afford a little bit of time to search a couple of files that I have on all of the Kilkenny and all of the Irish officers and all of the 714 Kilkenny soldiers who served. I have details on all of them. So if you think you might have some family connections, we can do a little search and see what we can find. Now, I won't have time to speak in depth about the British East India Company itself, either its evolution as a company or the evolution of its governance model, but suffice it to say that the East India Company was a private enterprise, and it was designed to extract wealth through trade and later through colonial occupation. And it used the levers of taxation and military prize to do that. Military prize is just a fancy way of saying officially sanctioned looting. It was headquartered then at India House, as we see on the screen here, and that was on Leadenhall Street in London. It was run by a court of directors comprising 24 directors up to 1853, and they were pared back then, those numbers, to 18 thereafter, 6 of whom were Crown appointees. During our period, there was about 2,000 investors, men and women drawn from right across Europe, and they were known as the Court of Proprietors, and company profits were returned to the investors in the form of dividends. If you do want to find out more about the company, I would heartily recommend William Dalrymple's brilliant book, The Anarchy, published in 2019 by Bloomsbury Press, and also a beautifully accessible podcast on empire hosted by Dalrymple and Anita Anand. And Anita, author of The Patient Assassin, another book on Indian empire with an Irish twist to it. So let's get in then to our lecture itself, and we'll make a start on that. Now, over its 120 years post-Union Ireland, 1801 to 1921, retained the vestiges of a colonial relationship, including a Lord Lieutenant, a Chief Secretary and Under Secretary, all appointed in and answerable to London. Ireland's economic, social and cultural interests were always subordinated to those of Britain, and further in terms of cultural stereotyping, its paramilitarised police force and law enforcement, as well as considerations such as trade, famine and education, Ireland was always treated differently to other parts of the United Kingdom, and it bore much more in common with India's colonial structures. Ultimately, the 1801 Act of Union contained within itself the seeds of its own disintegration, as British unwillingness to accommodate Ireland fully in the Union was a principal factor in precipitating Irish independence in 1921, as disillusioned Irish nationalists freed themselves from British rule and in the process served as a model for others. Now, a phenomenon known as imperial overstretch, stemming from the smallness of Britain's imperial core and its territorial area, its manpower and its natural resources, when compared to those of the vast empire it ruled, necessitated the collaboration of vanquished peoples for that empire to function and for that imperial army to function. And accordingly, the Asiatic Journal in the late 1830s noted that safeguarding this collaboration rendered the relationship, and I quote, between the ruling powers in India and the military one of extreme delicacy. And when we look at this, we can see the imperial core there. I've included Ireland, notwithstanding what I've said about Ireland's colonial structures. Ireland also gave thousands of soldiers, civil servants and other functionaries to empire. So it is part of the imperial core. It's actually both. It's both part of the imperial core and it's a colonised location as well. And to give you an example then of the sense of uneasiness and the sense of aggression that can come from that imperial core because of this imperial overstretch. When the first company servants arrived in India in 1608, India was a subcontinent of 120 million people. The capital, Delhi, the capital of the Mughal Empire, was a city of 2 million people, and India accounted for 25% of global manufactures. That equated to the entirety of Europe. By the time extractive empire had finished with India in 1947, India's share of global GDP was less than 3%. But this idea of a tiny core ruling a vast area gives this sense of instability and constant edginess in the core. And that's why we often get these very extreme reactions if empire seems to be threatened, either by Irish loyalty or by events abroad. And we'll see that as we go on. Now, what about then Ireland's relationship with empire and colonialism through this complex 19th century? Well, throughout the 19th century, a variety of nationalisms, plural, coexisted in Ireland, ranging from cultural and constitutional forms to radical republicanism. However, the variety of constitutional nationalism, which favoured maintaining Ireland's connection to empire, was ascendant through much of the 19th century. And this presents us with what historian Hiram Morgan called an uncomfortable heritage. Now, acknowledging this uncomfortable heritage, Sean Theocalic, in a speech given at New York in 1924 to the Friends of Freedom for India, said, and I quote, that India had been beaten into subjection by the work of Irish brains and Irish brawn and Irish muscle, and that as a result, Ireland would have to, quote, take definite steps to win back her good name. And strange words, probably to our ears, and doubtless with this purpose in mind, the winning back of Ireland's good name by taking definite steps, that a nexus of Indo-Irish radicalism emerges in the first half of the 20th century. And if you want to investigate that topic a little bit more closely, again, I would recommend another book, Kate O'Malley's brilliant book, India, Ireland and Empire, published in 2008 by Manchester University Press. Now, meanwhile, while that's happening, the fledgling Irish state set about decolonising its national history. The aim was to create a usable past that could give citizens a sense of national pride and purpose. Ireland's ideological approach to primary school education in 1922 was to Gaelicise all aspects of the curriculum so as to create a truly Irish outlook, in particular one which would highlight the struggle against oppression down through the centuries. 11 years later, in 1933, the Irish Department of Education mandated that, and I quote, among the specific objects to be prioritised in the teaching of Irish history were the study of the Gaelic civilization and the resistance of that civilization for 1,000 years to foreign domination. But did this pedagogical approach induce what some historians have called a problematic Irish imperial amnesia? Or, as Michael D. Higgins framed it in June 2021, a feigned imperial amnesia? Well, this lecture focuses on the military aspect of this question because throughout the 19th century, the quintessential Irish presence in India was not the missionary, the doctor, or the civil servant, but rather the Irish soldier. Between 1830 and 1860, which is a period we're covering tonight, Ireland supplied 603 officers and 24,239 other ranks just to the company's army alone. Of the officers, 5 were born in County Kilkenny and 31 more had Kilkenny links. Of the other ranks, 714 were Kilkenny born. 51% of these soldiers served in the Bengal Presidential Army, 25% of them served on the Madras establishment, and the remainder served at Bombay. So the Bengal Fusiliers, later, they were known as the Dirty Shirts. They later became the Royal Munster Fusiliers. This is how Irish they were. The Bombay Fusiliers, known as the Old Toughs, later were renamed to the Royal Dublin Fusiliers. And the Madras Fusiliers, known as the Lambs, later renamed as the Enniskillings, and also some of the battalions of the Leinsters came from those. That's how Irish those regiments were. So let's pause for a moment then to examine the composition of the Indian Army on the eve of the Great Indian Rebellion, which erupted in May 1857. So what we're looking at here is the private army of a private company that happens to be the largest land army on the planet, comprised 280,000 soldiers. Of those, 238,000 were native soldiers called sepoys, and 42,000 were European soldiers. Now, if we look at the European component, we can break that down into company soldiers directly employed by the company and who took an oath to the company, not to the monarch, and there was 14,000 of those. And then they were bolstered by an additional 28,000 crown troops that were seconded to the company and on a rota basis spent time in India. So let's look at the company component then. And we take a snapshot using the muster rolls at the outset of our period in 1830, and we had just over 12,000 soldiers, of whom 47.2% were Irish, almost 42% English, 7% Scottish, 0.5% Welsh, and 3% thereabouts who were born to European parentage in Europe. So those parents could be Irish, English, Scottish, Welsh, or whatever. Over the next 30 years, the company enlists 55,350 soldiers, of whom almost 44% are Irish, 41% or just over were English, 11% Scottish, 1% Welsh, and 2.7% the others. So we see in 1830 there's a real Irish flavour to this company component in India, and over the next 30 years there's a real Irish flavour to what is recruited thereafter. Now, what about the Crown soldiers? Well, during the Indian Rebellion, 1857 to 59, there were 6 Irish Crown regiments in India. But also, there are Irishmen stuffed into other English regiments. So the Cheshire Regiment was all Irish, 22nd Foot. The Shropshire Regiment, all Irish. The 16th Light Infantry, all Irish. The 24th Regiment of Foot, the Wiltshires, all Irish. So there's a very Irish flavour to that, and we'll see that as we go along as well. So what I'm going to do now is contextualise this phenomenon of Irish enlistment. Now, Irish Catholics were already enlisting unofficially into Britain's armies well before 1792, when this became an officially sanctioned policy. However, with the onset of the Napoleonic Wars, the enlistment and recruitment of Irish Catholics became a wholesale occurrence. Contemporary publications provide intriguing insights into this phenomenon. For example, following the collapse of the 1798 rebellion, Catholic Committee activist Edward Hay, seen up here on the left, who was an eyewitness to events in County Wexford. Not just an eyewitness, his brother John was hung on Wexford Bridge. His other brother James was a lieutenant general in the British Army. And these are the nuances of Irish history. They're a Catholic family. But Hay stated that great numbers of the former insurgents, of the United Irishmen's former insurgents, enlisted with the British force contesting the French campaign in Egypt and Syria, fought between 1798 and 1801. Irish general and contemporary pamphleteer George Cockburn, seen up here centre, said that half the British force in Egypt during those years was Irish. And then, according to repeal advocate John Cornelius O'Callaghan, a noted and respected Irish historian at the time, he stated that those men who went to Egypt sought revenge for Bonaparte's perceived lacklustre support for the Irishmen. So they're going over to Egypt, according to O'Callaghan, to give Napoleon a poke in the eye. By the time we get to 1807, former United Irishman Dr. William James McNevin claimed that about half the Crown's rank-and-file soldiers and two-thirds of its naval personnel in 1807 was Irish, while O'Callaghan asserted that up to two-thirds of Wellington's infantry at Waterloo were Irish. Now, lending credence to such reports, House of Commons military return, commissioned in March 1841, revealed that between 1830 and 1841, Irish infantry numbers in the British Army outnumbered the English and Welsh combined. Meanwhile, the East India Company consistently enlisted more Irish than English recruits between 1802 and 1860, and we've seen the numbers for 1830 to 60 on the chart here. We're looking at a wider time frame, and we have 90,000 soldiers who are recruited during this period. 46% Irish, 43% English, 10% Scottish, 1% Welsh. So again, over that wider period, a really Irish flavour to the company's army. And also, as we're seeing anecdotally with the British Army, but also with that military return now, a little more science put to it. Now, indeed, Irish manpower was such a crucial enabler to British expansionist policies in India by 1830 that the company's then military secretary, Colonel James Salmond, boasted that the Irish nursery seemed inexhaustible. So Ireland is described as a nursery. Think of a greenhouse, a place that you can grow a perfect specimen of something. So Ireland was considered a nursery for the perfect imperial shock troop. So we'll look at, well, how can this come to be? Now, importantly, at a time when Ireland accounted for a fraction of the United Kingdom's total population, the Irish comprised the largest European cohort within both the company and Crown armies. So what factors then influence this enlistment phenomenon? Now, reflecting on the mass recruitment of Irishmen, Charles Lennox, seen up here on the left, 4th Duke of Richmond and Lord Lieutenant of Ireland from 1807 to 1813, stated that a high-priced loaf and low scarce wages are the best recruiting sergeants for His Majesty. Travelling through Ireland in 1799, we get a South Asian view of Irish poverty. Misra Abu Talib Khan, a Persian born at Isfahan, but spent most of his life living in Bengal. We see him on the right-hand side up there. And he observed of Ireland's poor, the villages resemble those in India. The poverty of the peasants is such that the peasants of India are rich when compared to them. We step forward now to 1836, and while commenting on the mental and physical resilience of Irish soldiers fighting with the British Legion during the First Carlist War in Spain, 1833 to 40, Charles Thompson, an English officer, observed that in spite of their hardships, the severity of the winter, the badness of rations, the total want of pay, the Irish lived, throve and grew fat as if in the midst of clover. Such are the advantages of misery and starvation at home. Now, here we have Irish military virtue being coupled with the economic circumstances at home. So the Irish then present a prime military commodity to the company and to the crown, and the conditions at home provide the push factor as to pushing them to escape that poverty. And of course, the outlet is military. Now, Lennox's comments alert us to the colonial government's view that Ireland's poor comprised a fertile recruiting ground and that poverty was the compelling reason for Irish enlistment. Now, the pre-recruitment occupation data supports this anecdotal evidence. It's anecdotal, but it's well-founded. That more than 80% of the company's Irish soldiers were recorded as labourers, lowly paid servants, or those likely engaged in depressed trades, emphasises the economic rationale underlying enlistment. Thus, soldiering was a form of economic migration in an era where mobility was crucial to survival in Ireland's 19th century economy of makeshifts. While colonialism at home was an oppressive imposition on Ireland's poor, imperial service abroad, if you could get it, offered a modicum of opportunity. And if we look at the charts I have up here, we're looking at the total population of Irish soldiers recruited by the company during our period. 56% of them are labourers, or stated themselves to be labourers before they joined up. Think of landless labourers, think of those labouring on the lowest economic rung of the cities and towns in Ireland and England and elsewhere. Another 3% were in low-paid service, and almost a quarter had said that they were formerly tradesmen or artisans. You put those three groupings together, you're at 81%. There might be a little bit of adventurism among some of the tradesmen or artisans, who knows. White-collar workers are those that I've grouped in whose pre-enlistment occupations suggest maybe a better level of education, of literacy and numeracy. So we have clerks in there, we have apothecaries, we have schoolmasters, school teachers, and even one Catholic priest. Unfortunately, he's not from County Kilkenny, so we won't be able to discuss him tonight, but he is an intriguing character. So maybe there's a little bit of adventurism in there, but if you're a clerk and you're looking to serve in India, there's something wrong with the office, and the same with the trades. And what we're looking at are people who are in economic straits. They're deprived economically. When we split out the Kilkenny numbers and the view of that, 60% of Kilkenny's company recruits in our period were labourers, 6% in low-paid service, and then 18% tradesmen and artisans. White collar almost the same as the overall number, but that's 84% just there alone. So what we're saying there is that the empirical evidence does back up what we're hearing anecdotally from the primary sources at that time. Now, political considerations at home and in India could also influence recruitment. The period witnessing O'Connell's renewed repeal campaign and the launch of the very influential Nation newspaper in the early 1840s coincided with a temporary dip in Irish recruitment into the company's armies. Meanwhile, warfare in India drove a series of recruitment peaks. Thus, 5,553 Irish soldiers enlisted between 1845 and 1850, when the great Irish famine calamity at home coincided with a crisis precipitated by two Anglo-Sikh wars in India. It was greatly feared during the Anglo-Sikh wars that India would be lost to empire. At this time, twice as many Irish than Englishmen enlisted, while in response to the Indian Rebellion 1857-59, England supplied 1.4 times more recruits than Ireland, although at this latter period Irish recruitment was higher than ever at more than 6,440 men. So looking at our chart here, we have the mass recruitment of Irish versus English soldiers over our period, and we do see indeed there's a series of recruitment peaks and troughs throughout this era. Each of the peaks does coincide with warfare in South Asia. So we have the first Anglo-Afghan War, first Anglo-Chinese War, the Opium War, the Sindh and Gwalior campaigns in India, and the raising of 2 European light infantry regiments, one for the Bengal and one for the Madras Presidency in India. Most of those men joining those regiments were Irish. The Irish are represented by the blue line and the English by the red line. Now, what's interesting here is we hit this little period here in the early 1840s where we see a dip in Irish recruitment, and it does coincide with monster meetings at home. It does coincide with the launch of the Nation. The Nation had a circulation of about 10,000, but multiply that circulation many times over when you take into account reading rooms and public readings of newspapers. Some historians reckon that the Nation was reaching an audience of about 250,000 Irish. And the Irish are learning about their history, they're being informed politically, and we see a response. Again, it's kind of emphasising that there's an economic reason underlying, and especially we see it then during the Great Irish Famine calamity and the aftermath. Irish enlistment just really takes off in that period. We get then to the Indian Rebellion, 1857-59. It's in after that rebellion that the entire colonial apparatus and military apparatus of the East India Company is absorbed under Crown and parliamentary control, because it was such a shocking experience for empire in India in this period. But the English papers really stoke up a frenzy of patriotic sentiment amongst military-age young Englishmen. They're highlighting massacres of men, women and children, Europeans, of course, in India. They're not highlighting the reprisals, the horrific reprisals that are taken. But we get this huge peak of a response in England, much less so in Ireland, but yet higher than at any other period during the time that we're looking at here. Now, in Ireland, newspapers were much more likely to side or have sympathy for the Indian rebels, especially the radical newspapers, and you do get a much less of a response. Now, this peak in English recruitment is very short-lived. They're out there for the rebellion, and then under the Lord Canning's Act of 1859, they almost leave en masse as well. The Irish stay in India, so you even get a higher concentration in the Indian Army after this period, once the rebellion has been suppressed. Now, a third factor influencing Irish enlistment was Ireland's long-standing military tradition, which highly valued martial virtue. Ireland was a highly militarised country, unlike the Ireland of today, and the stereotype of the fighting Irish was one of the few acceptable to all shades of Irish nationalists. From the late 17th century to the mid-18th century, approximately 1,000 Irishmen a year enlisted in Europe's armies, mainly the armies of France, Spain and Austria and the like. And this is a generally celebrated variety of Irish imperial service because it was imperial service. Some continuity exists between recruitment into continental armies up to the 1730s, especially in terms of Munster counties, and later company enlistment trends. However, the company exploited Ireland's recruitment potential much more effectively than any Europeans could, garnering 1,500 recruits annually with every county contributing. So we have a regional view of Irish enlistment here by the provinces, and we see here Munster provides almost 42% of our total 24,000 plus soldiers over our period. Leinster is about 11 points behind. Connacht, very underrepresented, probably due to a large monoglot Irish-speaking population, but also competition from a very established regiment over there, the Connacht Rangers. Ulster also quite underrepresented, but for economic reasons. And this includes the 9 counties of Ulster. Ulster was more prosperous by and large than most of the rest of Ireland. And again, this underlines the economic rationale for enlisting. Now, over here, I've done a league table of Irish counties ranked by the number of recruits that were recruited from each of these counties. And up on top there, we see County Cork, which today we would say the rebels, but not so when we look back into our complicated 19th century history. In fact, I've highlighted all 6 of the Munster counties, and they're all in the top third of the league table. Now, if we take Cork, Tipperary, Clare, Waterford, and Kilkenny at number 11, just outside the top third, those are the counties that Continental armies typically went to as their go-to places for recruiting. And there is that continuity with the company. The company mined those same areas, but much more effectively. Every county is included, all 32, and 17 recruits at the bottom whose county of origin was not recorded. Now, that Irishmen enlisted with the company at more than 70 locations throughout Ireland, 62 locations in England and Wales, 23 locations in India and 4 in Scotland, demonstrates the pervasive nature of the company's recruitment apparatus on a global basis. While Kilkenny ranked 11th in the company's enlistment league, Munster was Empire's recruiting province of choice. Now, if we look at a local level then for County Kilkenny, recruits were drawn from more than 52 locations throughout County Kilkenny, with the city and larger county towns supplying the lion's share. Just about everywhere that you can think of in Kilkenny. These 41 recruits over here are drawn from over 30 other locations. I have another grouping here in South Kilkenny near Waterford City. But the point here is that even though Kilkenny is number 11 on that enlistment league, there is not a little village or little townland in Kilkenny during this period that was not aware of the East India Company and that was not aware of the opportunities to enlist if you could get them, because recruits were drawn from all of these areas. But the question then, were these viewed as high quality recruits? Well, the service branches that Irish enlistees were assigned to in India do reveal something of the company's high regard for Irish recruits. In evidence given to a Royal Commission in 1863, Dr. John McCosh, a retired company surgeon, noted that the company only selected the highest calibre enlistees as artillerymen. These were individuals capable of mastering and remedying the technicalities of complex mechanical devices, even in the heat of battle. 45% of Ireland's enlistees during our period were assigned to Indian artillery regiments. These were men that McCosh labelled as more ambitious, healthy, careful, steady, studious and active than infantrymen. And as demonstrated on our chart behind me, these attributes were applicable to 51% of Kilkenny's enlistees. So again, we're looking at our total population here over our period, and 45% of Irish enlistees, or just about 11,000 of them, went to the foot and horse artillery in India, 43% to the foot regiments, 7% cavalry, and then there was about 5% that made it to non-commissioned officer or higher, or were assigned to sappers and miners, which essentially is a term for engineering regiments. Now, the fact that there's less Irish soldiers going to foot regiments does not negate the Irish flavour to these foot regiments. These were very Irish flavoured regiments. It's just that there was much more intense flavour, Irish flavour about the artillery regiments. And again, we see for Kilkenny, 51% to the artillery, 37% to the foot. and cavalry and others the same. Now, cavalry, those 7% were recruited in response to a phenomenon during the Indian Rebellion, where many of the Bengal cavalry regiments, the native regiments, defected to the rebel side. And there's a real panic then to get European cavalry recruited to India. So when you're looking at those, they were only enlisted between 1857 and 1860. So now let's shed some light on the soldiering experience in India through Kilkenny eyes. On enlisting, Irish recruits were shipped under escort and subject to the Articles of War to the company's London depot at either Brompton or later Warley Barracks. And there they joined recruits drawn from across the UK and Empire to undergo 2 months of initial training. Camaraderie and the forging of soldierly networks began almost immediately on enlistment and could continue beyond service in India. Soldierly networks could include wider family members, both at home and abroad, and often transcended the national, cultural and confessional boundaries prevalent at home. Camaraderie regularly found expression in soldiers' wills, which were often drafted and witnessed on their deathbeds in cantonment or field hospitals, as men committed their final thoughts and the disposal of their assets to paper. For example, John Sharky, a former servant from Kilkenny City, enlisted at Dublin on the 22nd of July 1842, and he embarked for India on board a troop carrier called the John Bibby, where he joined the 1st Bengal European Light Infantry. He was killed in action at the Battle of Sobraon on the 10th of February 1846 during the First Sikh War, and that was the opening chart that I had up, that very colourful Sikh view of the Battle of Sobraon. By a will dated the 20th of December 1845, drafted ahead of the very bloody 2-day Battle of Ferozeshah, which was also fought during the First Sikh War, Sharky left about £9 2 shillings, or 6 months' wages, to his friend John McKay. And John McKay served in the same unit. McKay was from Argoyle and had enlisted at Edinburgh in October 1842. Sharky presciently stated in his will that he, and I quote, being in sound mind and health, but considering in life we are in death, do make this my last will and testament. His sense of foreboding was both common among company soldiers and well-founded. From the time that he penned those words, he had little under 2 months to live. Importantly, though, here we see evidence for enlisted men in India intent on advantaging each other, regardless of their national, cultural or confessional affiliations. And the military records contain many such examples. Even getting to India, though, was fraught with danger. The 20th of August 1839 was the embarkation date for 371 infantry recruits from Brompton Barracks bound for India on board the Edinburgh. One of the first drafts destined to join the newly raised 2nd Bengal European Regiment. Of these men, 214, or almost 58%, were Irish, and among them were 4 Kilkenny men: John Bergin from North Kilkenny, Joseph Cooper from Stonyford, Marc and Edward Prendergast, both from the James's Street area of the city. Bergin, a servant, enlisted at London in June 1839 and was invalided to Europe in 1853. So surviving India didn't mean that you came home unscathed. Cooper from Stonyford, also a labourer, enlisted at Clonmel in May 1839 and was invalided to Europe in 1844. Prendergast, a labourer, enlisted at Limerick on the 17th of June 1839, while Cana, a shoemaker, enlisted at Waterford 12 days later. The Edinburgh, a converted 1,424-ton company Indiaman, was crewed in the proportions of 3 native Indian lascars to every 1 European sailor. The endemic racism that plagued even the lower social echelons of empire became evident early in the voyage, when some unidentified soldiers callously threw a lump of pork meat amongst a group of Muslim lascars, an offensive act which almost provoked a serious riot on the ship. On boarding, each recruit had been issued with a hammock and necessaries. Necessaries included articles such as soap, needle, thread, eating utensils, etc. The men were organised into messes of 6 who ate together, and larger units tasked with sundry on-board duties. Confusion and seasickness marked the early days of the voyage, when even slinging a hammock proved insurmountable for some, who resorted to temporarily sleeping on deck. The hospital and married quarters were assigned to the gun or the middle deck, while single men were crammed into the lowest or orlop deck, where light and air were admitted only through hatches. These hatches were battened and secured with tarpaulins during storms, trapping the men in a terrifying and claustrophobic space, styled by one soldier the black hole of the orlop. Major William Gardner, the officer commanding, showed scant regard for the men's morale, and 5 months into the voyage was a monotonous continuum where, in the words of one soldier, dullness reigned supreme. The situation deteriorated further when food and water ran short 2 months into the voyage, likely due to sharp practice among the ship's provisioners. When rationing was imposed, troop cohesion began to fray, and a grudging order was only restored at bayonet point when 2 English privates were publicly flogged. The recruits continued on short rations until they disembarked at Calcutta on the 22nd of January 1840. 2 soldiers died on the voyage, one due to medical malpractice and the other by suicide. On arrival, our 4 Kilkenny friends and their young comrades were assailed by a slew of novel sensations. They marvelled at the lightness of the Bengalis' clothing. They experienced their first taste of curry, which, in the words of one soldier, settled a good many of the men's digestive tracts. They marvelled at the trained elephants and camels that accompanied their marching columns, and they were entertained by the Rajah of Bergin, who invited the men to view his private menagerie. Likewise, they watched with some humour as a former Dundalk labourer called Owen Brady chased a monkey up a tree, only to fall out of it and break his leg. So he was likely chasing a langur up the tree. And if we think back to the prevalence of Cork men in the Indian Army, Brady could have been said to be acting the langur, or in the Cork parlance, he was a langer. And it's where we get the word. But arriving safely in India was not guaranteed, and the ironically named troop carrier, the Protector, which foundered in a violent storm at the mouth of the Ganges in October 1838, is a case in point. The Protector sank with the loss of all but 8 of the ship's complement of 178 souls. These included 116 company recruits, accompanied by 16 women and 10 children. Of these, more than 2/3 were Irish. Among those who perished were 2 County Kilkenny recruits, Edward and John Brown, both labourers from South Kilkenny, living not far from Carrick-on-Suir. Probably relatives, maybe even brothers. Having previously emigrated to England, Edward to Liverpool and John to Manchester, their hopes of a better life in Britain's industrial cities were not realised, and they both enlisted in June 1837 with tragic consequences. That the 3 Irishmen who actually managed to survive this disaster ultimately died in India underlines the appalling mortality rates for soldiers. About 64% of Irish troops assigned to Bengal died in the period 1830 to 1850. Mortality on the Madras establishment was just over 50% in the same period, and those serving at Bombay saw mortality of about 50%. In the decade 1840 to 49, however, mortality among the second Bengal Europeans that our 4 Kilkenny men joined averaged a staggering 8.4% per annum, while annual mortality among the soldiers' wives was even worse at 9.3%. So that means 84% of the men and 93% of the women who were alive in 1840 were dead within 9 years. Edward Prendergast, whom we've already encountered from the James's Street area of Kilkenny, was one of a number of recruits who died at the cantonment infirmary at Gazipur on the banks of the Ganges, where the regiment was stationed between late November 1840 and March 1842. He died intestate on the 6th of August 1841, leaving an estate worth just over £1 10 shillings, which remained unclaimed 2 years later. Fellow Kilkenny man Marc, now a drummer with the 2nd Europeans, aged 22, married Jane Crowder in Keys, a 36-year-old widow, at Kanpur on the 27th of June 1842. He survived India and was scheduled to return home in November 1854, when we lose trace of him in the documentary sources. Early death was mainly the result of tropical illness, often exacerbated by hardship and the soldiers' unhealthy lifestyles, especially alcohol consumption. Equally lethal, warfare was the next highest contributor to mortality, and rates noticeably surged during military campaigns. For example, the 2nd Bengal Europeans witnessed the regiment's single highest annual mortality rate at 21% in 1849, with the climax of the Second Sikh War. Warfare, however, also offered some opportunity for advancement to ordinary soldiers, and in late September 1857, during the Indian Rebellion, 3 Victoria Crosses were awarded to Irish recipients of the 1st Madras Fusiliers. One of these was John Ryan, a former labourer from Kilkenny City, who enlisted at Kilkenny on the 28th of January 1841, aged 19. He saw action during the 2nd Anglo-Sikh War, 1848-49, the 2nd Anglo-Burmese War, 1852-53, and was subsequently awarded Punjab and Pegu campaign medals. Ryan became romantically involved with a native Hindi woman named Anamal at John Pereira's, adjacent to Fort St. George in Madras, who subsequently gave birth to a daughter. So Madras would be present-day Chennai in India. The child was named Mary, and her baptismal papers stated her to be Ryan's, and I quote, illegitimate daughter. And Mary was born on the 4th of August 1857. That Mary was not baptised until after Ryan's death suggests that this was to ensure that as a Eurasian child she could secure his estate in accordance with his express wishes. Ryan was awarded his VC for repeatedly risking his life during the 26th of September 1857 at the first relief of Lucknow, a battle fought during the Indian Rebellion. First, he rescued a wounded captain of the 1st Madras Fusiliers and later many others, saving them from certain death. And it's nice to know that John Ryan was awarded his Victoria Cross for saving life rather than taking it. He died on the 9th of March 1858 at Kanpur and was interred there. By his will, he bequeathed approximately £44 sterling to Mary, living, and I quote from his will, at Madras or elsewhere, absolutely for her sole and separate use, her receipt alone being a sufficient discharge, the whole of my estate and effects, and everything that I can by law give or dispose of. Ryan's military estate papers state that the deceased was a bachelor. His medals were retained by the Indian Military Department in July 1869, and his VC, Indian Mutiny medals, Indian Mutiny and Punjab campaign medals remain to this day with the National Army Museum in London. And it would be a lovely thing if those could be repatriated to Kilkenny and maybe curated and interpreted someplace like our Medieval Mile Museum. But we see up here, that is John Ryan's VC, his Victoria Cross, and the obverse and reverse sides of his Mutiny Medal with the clasp Defence of Lucknow mentioned on it. Now, this case demonstrates that some Kilkenny and indeed Irish soldiers lived in affectionate relationships with Indian women. Anamal is a Hindi name particularly associated with the southern parts of India. On his deathbed, Mary's future welfare was foremost in Ryan's thoughts, and his bequest would have been life-transforming for her. Regrettably, no evidence has yet emerged to demonstrate that Ryan's final wishes were fulfilled. Mental illness also took its toll on the Irish in India, and Kilkenny soldiers were no exception, with 7 cases or 1% of their total recorded between 1831 and 1859. Private John Glendon, a former labourer from John Street in the city, was one such case. Glendon enlisted at Kilkenny on the 7th of September 1832 and was assigned to the Bengal Foot Artillery as a gunner, so he was a promising recruit. 4 years later, he was recorded as having been, and I quote, transferred to a lunatic asylum. He subsequently died on St. Patrick's Day 1841 at Dr. Williams of Pembroke House at Hackney in London. From 1818, the company sent those diagnosed as insane in India to Pembroke House. The proprietor then, Dr. Rees, a Welshman, received £40 sterling annually for so-called second-class patients and £100 sterling annually for those ascribed first class. And of course, that social differentiation is based purely on class. By March 1851, the asylum was run by Martha Williams, an 80-year-old Welshwoman, with patients cared for by her son, Walter Davis Williams, a physician. Of 103 patients resident at Pembroke House recorded in the March 1851 census, described as former company soldiers or civil servants, 65 or 63% of them were Irish. And that's an area where I've ongoing research into the casebooks of these Irish people. Interestingly, James Glendon, a former butcher from the city, also enlisted at Kilkenny in 1832, but 2 months earlier than John, who we mentioned above. The two were probably brothers or cousins, and James died on the 8th of January 1842 during Elphinstone's disastrous retreat from Kabul during the First Anglo-Afghan War. Thus, both of these Glendon boys died tragically thousands of miles apart, but within 10 months of each other. Though scarcely qualifying as a perk, access to Pembroke House, regular wages, the provision of military hospitals, burial allowances, Catholic chaplains, Catholic-run orphanages, reading libraries, and control over the accumulation and disposal of one's assets gave a measure of agency to company enlistees hardly imaginable among their peers at home. But what about those left at home, and especially Irish nationalists? How did they respond to this phenomenon of so many soldiers, Irish soldiers serving in Crown or Company armies? Well, this response may be gauged through contemporary press reports and other publications. Broadly speaking, these men were central to a polemical discourse involving the embodiment of idealised Irish military virtue and national aspirations. For the contemporary popular British press, the overrepresentation of Irish soldiers in Crown and Company regiments could precipitate acute anxiety. Think imperial overstretch. Reporting on riots at Limerick and Carrick-on-Suir in mid-1829, sparked by conflicting O'Connellite sentiments within the army, the London Times Irish correspondent claimed a moiety or half of the soldiers, indeed I've heard 3/4 now in Ireland, are Catholics and Irishmen. Even the greater part of the Highland regiments, it is well known, belong to this country, in other words Irish. They have manifestly been inoculated with the feelings of those among whom they live and from whom they were taken. We've already noted the assessments of John Cornelius O'Callaghan regarding the prevalence of Irish soldiers in Crown armies. In the period 1841 to 43, when we saw that temporary dip in Irish recruitment, and in response to violently hibernophobic anti-repeal vitriol published in the London press, O'Callaghan argued that the Irish repeal campaign could not be repressed by a Crown army comprised mainly of Irishmen. The Irish in company service in India were likewise central to polemical press exchanges in the mid-century. During the Sikh Wars, when London feared that India might be lost to empire, the Irish Commander-in-Chief in India, 1843 to 49, Lord Hugh Gough, was regularly excoriated in the British metropolitan and provincial press for his Tipperary tactics, his Donnybrook discipline, and his Irish blood, all of which supposedly rendered him unfit for command. These derogatory cultural stereotypes were deployed against Gough to effect his supersession as Commander-in-Chief. In response, the Irish O'Connellite press mounted a vigorous and sustained defence of Gough and his Irish soldiers in India, aimed at rehabilitating their reputations. These geographically dispersed Irish papers included the Freeman's Journal, the Cork Examiner, the Tipperary Vindicator, and the Galway Vindicator, among others. Three common themes permeated their commentary. First, criticism for British rule in Ireland. Second, a robust defence of Gough and his Irish soldiers. And third, British dependence on Irish soldiers to win their imperial victories for them. When Gough eventually prevailed in India, the O'Connellite press was quick to capitalise on the irony of the British establishment's U-turn regarding him. The Freeman sarcastically proclaimed, "Lord Gough, the incompetent old Irish gladiator, the Donnybrook combatant, has added a leaf of evergreen to the laurels of the United Kingdom at Gujarat." Gujarat was the defining battle of the Second Sikh War. Considering how much of the wreath, the victory wreath that is, has been contributed by our countrymen, we would humbly remind Britannia that looks of impudence towards either Tipperary or Donnybrook are not quite becoming under brows so decorated. The salient issue here was not that great numbers of Irishmen were coercively upholding British colonialism in India, but rather that the British establishment underappreciated Irish imperial service. While the Tipperary Vindicator lamented the fall and freedom of the Sikhs, it yet lauded Gough, styled the Tipperary man, the grey-haired warrior Irishman. Gough was over 70 years of age at this time. It further extolled his fellow countrymen who, at the Battle of Gujarat, rushed to the encounter and dealt destruction and death among the opposing ranks. However, like the Freemans, a note of caution was also sounded. Yet mark the ingratitude of the nation they serve. Look at the condemnation that was heaped on Lord Gough, now so strongly falsified, and listen, if you can, to the abuses pronounced by the ruffian Times and the rancorous Mail against the Irish people who pour out their blood like water in achieving victories for a country hostile to their interests. The response of the more radical Irish press outlets was equally remarkable. The popular radical newspaper The Nation was suppressed between July 1848 and September 1849, which coincided with the Second Sikh War, and unfortunately we don't get commentary from The Nation at that period. However, it roundly criticised company expansionism in India and supported the Afghan and Sikh causes over the period October 1842 to February 1846. During the First Sikh War, it branded the Indian government as banditti, seeking any pretext for war. The Nation hoped that the imperial armies would be repelled with, quote, torn banners and ignominious rout to the very gates of Delhi. In contrast to this, words such as bold, gallant and chivalrous were used to characterise the Sikhs, who were urged to patch up their differences with the Afghans and unite against their common enemy. Gough and his soldiers escaped criticism, however, especially when the composition of casualties sustained at the battles of Mudki and Ferozeshah in late December 1845 became known, two battles during the First Sikh War. Here the nation separated the common soldier from British imperial machinations, declaring 4,000 brave men have fallen, fighting in an unholy cause, and amongst them many hundreds of our own Irish countrymen. This comes from being found in Bad Company. That's a play on East India Company, and also the biblical admonition that bad company corrupted good manners. Let all honour be given to the memory of these gallant soldiers. Never, even at Waterloo, did British and Irish troops acquit themselves with more desperate valour. They fell as became soldiers. May they rest well. While this commentary further underscores the crucial role played by Irish soldiers in imperial wars, their martial virtue, though extolled, was viewed by the editors as misplaced. Over the ensuing decade, the Nation, now back in print, often returned to the theme of Irish soldiers in India. Grudging and at times outright respect was afforded to Gough. In December 1857, a lecture on India, Empire and Ireland was delivered to the Catholic Young Men's Society in Dublin by Marc S. O'Shaughnessy, a barrister. The proceedings were opened by the Very Reverend Dr. Spratt, a popular temperance advocate and eventual Vicar General of the Irish Carmelites. The proceedings were closed by the Very Reverend Dr. Charles Russell, Professor of Ecclesiastical History at Maynooth, after whom the Russell Library at St. Patrick's is still named. The Nation noted that O'Shaughnessy's lecture was frequently interrupted by applause. Though reported as well delivered, O'Shaughnessy's address was criticised for withholding the whole truth about India from his audience. Gough was presented as exemplifying this whole truth, characterised as, and I quote, a valiant Irish jackass who devoted his valour to the service of England's covetous thirst for aggression, and who, at the moment he got into difficulty at Chillianwalla, the Battle of Chillianwalla, the taunt Irishman was flung in his face. However, far from diverting his young audience away from service to empire, O'Shaughnessy's lecture had evidently enthused them. 2 weeks later, in addressing the inaugural meeting of the Limerick Mechanics Institute, former Young Irelander and Nation contributor William Smith O'Brien, while promoting Irish self-reliance, included Gough among a pantheon of Irishmen who had proved themselves to be capable of doing all that has been done by the noblest of other nations. O'Brien stated, almost the last of those who won a hereditary distinction in the peerage of England was a child of North Munster who, with his Tipperary tactics, won every battle in which he was engaged. But I must leave the story of Irish valour from the time of Conn of the 100 Battles down to that of Lord Gough to be told by some more competent narrator. Evidently, even the radical nation could oscillate between imperial condemnation and imperial accommodation within the period of a fortnight. By the mid-19th century, the Kilkenny Journal's more radical stance greatly annoyed moderates like John O'Connell MP, son of the Liberator. In reprinting reports of the Battle of Ferozeshall carried by the London and Indian press in February 1846, the Kilkenny Journal was supportive of the Sikhs, while simultaneously sympathetic to Irish soldiers caught in the Punjab. It reported of the Battle of Ferozeshall, the accounts from India will bring wailing to many a homestead. And then going on to say, there are shouts of victory. There are also wild cries of lamentation. The valiant who fell in that desperate struggle, of whom many and some of the most distinguished for bravery were our own countrymen, we regret. Their bravery, according to the editor, would bring cold comfort to their sorrowing friends, because these Irishmen had not fallen in a holier cause than carrying a desolating war into a land of free men. And of course, the holier cause would have been if they had devoted their military virtue to Ireland. Though Gough was not criticised directly, he was not defended as he was in the O'Connellite press. Rather, the Kilkenny Journal uncritically reprinted anti-Gough vitriol published by the British press, while also publishing some articles complimentary of him. For example, it reproduced a ditty from the Morning Chronicle of March 1846, which lampooned Gough following the Battle of Ferozeshall as a contemporary King Pyrrhus, so great were the British losses at that battle. A month later, Gough and his Irish soldiers were credited with raising a £1,000 sterling subscription for Irish famine relief. So these are soldiers on 1 shilling a day, less expenses. It gives us an idea of the numbers of them to get £1,000 sterling together, but also their awareness of what's going on in Ireland from their perspective or their viewpoint in India. The Kilkenny Journal steadfastly supported the Sikhs while condemning British imperial policy in India during the interbellum between the two Sikh wars and during the Second Sikh War. It also steadfastly sat on the fence regarding Gough and his Irish soldiers. However, following early reports of the Battle of Chillianwalla fought on the 13th of January 1849, and these reports based solely on camp gossip, which was published verbatim in the London papers, the Kilkenny Journal at last directly criticised Gough and his Irish soldiers. In an article laden with irony, it claimed that the decimated 24th Regiment of Foot was Irish, reporting, and I quote, "Paddy the pauper was foremost in the fray, and full dearly have they paid the penalty for their Celtic daring." It said that the government they were dying on a foreign field to sustain was at the same moment starving their kindred at home and forging heavier chains for their native land. However, in implying that pauperised Irishmen who enlisted were betraying their starving kin at home was somewhat disingenuous. First, the editor likely enjoyed a comfortable circumstances, while he knew that those of Ireland's lower classes were immeasurably bleak. Secondly, since these soldiers were identified as pauperised, it seems unrealistic to have expected them to sacrifice their own need for survival on the altar of middle-class national politics. And finally, the Kilkenny Journal had previously lauded these same pauperised soldiers for their generosity towards their starving peers at home. Following news of Gough's victory at Gujarat, further criticism of the Irish general stopped, and the Kilkenny Journal, like the Freeman's, contented itself to mocking the hypocrisy of the London establishment, whose hibernophobic clamour for Gough's head had quickly transformed itself into popular acclaim. By September 1857, the Kilkenny Journal upheld the rebel cause in India. It was particularly scathing of the prominent Catholic nationalists who supported Dublin Lord Mayor's fundraiser for European victims of the Indian Rebellion. Michael Joseph Barry, the former Young Ireland poet and lyricist, was labelled a renegade, a traitor, a slave, Brutus and Judas. The journal was hardly holding back. It claimed that Ireland was delighted that not a single priest attended to sympathise with the torturers and woman floggers of India. And it concluded its polemical rebuff saying that although the atrocities of a few sepoys admit no palliation, in murder they only follow their enemy's bloody track. The people of Ireland have no sympathy for the Sassenach sword, which has too often been red with the blood of their fathers. Now, while these radical views offer a counterweight to the O'Connellite papers and present an as yet inchoate Irish affinity with Indian radicalism, they also highlight the deep divisions besetting Irish nationalism over the question of Ireland's place in empire. However, as O'Shaughnessy's address to the CYMS 2 months after the Lord Mayor's meeting demonstrates, the Kilkenny Journal neither represented the views of all Irish nationalists nor of all Ireland's Catholic clergy, as it claimed. In conclusion then, using Kilkenny's company soldiers as a lens, this lecture has explored Ireland's military presence in India during the middle third of the 19th century. Something of these soldiers' experiences, motivations, hopes and fears has been gauged. Further, the response of contemporary Irish nationalist newspapers to this phenomenon has shed light on how these imperial entanglements were perceived at home. While Ireland's nationalist newspapers oscillated between odium for colonialism at home and imperial accommodation abroad, the more radical voices at home struggled to divert Ireland's military-age lower classes away from empire and towards the Irish national cause. Throughout this period, the majority of the company's white soldiers were Irish and Catholic. Without them, Britain's imperial military machine in India could scarcely have functioned. Grinding poverty at home and the allurement of empire's circumscribed opportunities abroad fuelled Irish enlistment, what James Connolly later labelled as economic conscription. that Irishmen comprised a crucial element in the imperial state's coercive apparatus in India obliges us to think more expansively on the question of Ireland and empire. This is not a monolithic narrative of victimhood and resistance to colonialism. It's more uncomfortable than that. Indeed, to study empire and Ireland is to engage in a process of posing difficult questions for the modern nation. Thank you very much for your time.